You are sitting still right now. You are reading this or listening to it in a fixed location, in a building, in a city or town that has probably existed for decades or centuries. The ground beneath you has a name. The country you are in has borders. You know with reasonable certainty where you are. Your ancestors had none of that. And they walked anyway. Approximately 70,000 years ago, a small group of human beings crossed out of Africa into the Arabian Peninsula. They were not explorers in any sense you would recognize. They had no maps. They had no concept of continents or oceans or hemispheres. They had no idea what lay ahead of them, how far the land extended, whether it ended at all. They had no compass, no written language, no metal tools, no domesticated animals to carry their supplies. They had fire, stone, and each other. Within 60,000 years, their descendants had reached every habitable continent on Earth. This is the most extraordinary journey in the history of life on this planet. Not because of the technology involved, there was almost none, but because of what it required of the human mind and body. The sustained, multi-generational, continent-spanning movement of a species equipped with nothing but intelligence, social bonds, and an apparently inexhaustible willingness to keep moving into the unknown. To understand how it happened, you first need to understand something counterintuitive about our species. Humans are not naturally sedentary. The image of the settled, stable, rooted human being is historically extremely recent. For the vast majority of our evolutionary history, something in the order of 95% of the total time Homo sapiens has existed, human beings moved, constantly. Not randomly, but with purpose and pattern. They followed game. They tracked seasonal food sources. They moved when resources thinned, when populations grew, when conflict made staying untenable. The anthropologist and evolutionary biologist Herman Pontzer at Duke University, whose research on the Hadza people of Tanzania, one of the last surviving hunter-gatherer populations on Earth, has transformed our understanding of how much energy ancient humans actually expended in daily life, describes the human body as a machine that evolved specifically for sustained long-distance locomotion. Not speed, which is where most large predators have us beaten, not raw strength, but endurance. The ability to cover ground, day after day, week after week, for distances that would destroy most other animals. Your body is built for this. The Achilles tendon stores and releases energy with each stride. The gluteus maximus, the largest muscle in the human body, exists primarily not to sit, but to stabilize the trunk during running. The human foot, with its distinctive arch, acts as a spring that returns energy to the stride. You sweat across the entire surface of your skin, a cooling system that allows you to run for hours in heat that would shut down a faster but less efficiently cooled animal. The evolutionary biologist Daniel Lieberman at Harvard University has spent decades studying what he calls the endurance running hypothesis, the proposal that the human body was shaped by natural selection, specifically to allow long-distance pursuit of prey across open terrain. Every feature of your anatomy that seems unremarkable is, on examination, a deeply specialized piece of long-distance travel equipment. This body left Africa and began walking. But where and why? The initial route out of Africa, the path that paleogeneticists have traced through ancient DNA evidence, appears to have run through what is now the Sinai Peninsula and into the Arabian Peninsula, across a landscape that was substantially different 70,000 years ago than it is today. The Sahara was greener. The Arabian Peninsula had rivers and lakes and grasslands where there is now desert. The climate fluctuations of the Pleistocene epoch created what researchers call green corridors, passable routes through otherwise impassable terrain that opened and closed over thousands of years, like doors swinging on slow hinges. The geneticist Eske Willerslev at the University of Copenhagen, whose work on ancient DNA has fundamentally reshaped our understanding of prehistoric human migration, has argued that human populations did not spread in a single wave, but in a series of pulses, moving forward when conditions were favorable and retreating or fragmenting when conditions turned harsh. The journey out of Africa was not a march. It was more like a tide, advancing and receding over millennia, leaving populations stranded on the far side of each advance, isolated long enough to begin diverging genetically before the next connection was made. From the Arabian Peninsula, the evidence suggests humans moved in two broad directions. Some pushed northward and westward, eventually reaching Europe. Others pushed eastward and southward along the coastlines of South Asia, following a route sometimes called the Southern Dispersal. This coastal route offered consistent food sources, shellfish, fish, coastal plants, in ways that inland routes through dense forest or open savanna could not always provide. The evidence for this coastal migration is tantalizing and frustratingly incomplete, because coastlines change. The sea levels of 70,000 years ago were dramatically lower than today. What was then the beach on which ancient humans walked, camped, and died is now submerged under anywhere from 50 to 100 meters of ocean. The most direct archaeological evidence for the earliest stages of this migration is literally underwater. What researchers have instead is genetic evidence, population trees built from DNA that show the relationships between ancient populations and allow scientists to reconstruct when and where those populations diverged from common ancestors. Those genetic trees tell a story of breathtaking speed in evolutionary terms. Within perhaps 20,000 years of leaving Africa, some human populations had reached Southeast Asia. Within a further 10,000 years, some of their descendants had crossed from Southeast Asia to Australia, a crossing that required either a deliberate ocean voyage or an extraordinary series of island-hopping steps across what was then a narrower but still formidable gap of open water. The fact that humans reached Australia by at least 65,000 years ago, a date established through a combination of archaeological finds and refined dating techniques, means they were crossing open water tens of thousands of years before any civilization built what we would recognize as a seaworthy boat. This was not an accident. You cannot stumble across 65,000-year-old Australia. Getting there required intention, planning, the construction of some kind of watercraft, and the organized effort of enough people to found a viable founding population. Whatever those ancient Australians used to cross the water, whether rafts made from bound logs, reed boats, dugout canoes, or something else entirely that has left no trace in the archaeological record, they built it deliberately, and they crossed deliberately. The journey to Australia is one of the most striking pieces of evidence we have that ancient humans were cognitively and behaviorally modern in every sense that matters, capable of planning, cooperation, and purposeful navigation, long before the dates that popular accounts of human history usually assign to such capabilities. The settlement of Europe followed a different, and in some ways more complex, trajectory. Modern humans arrived in Europe approximately 45,000 years ago. But they were not arriving into empty territory. Neanderthals had been living in Europe for at least 200,000 years. What followed was not, as far as the evidence suggests, a straightforward conquest or displacement. The genetic record shows that modern humans and Neanderthals interbred. If you are not of sub-Saharan African descent, approximately 1 to 4% of your DNA comes from Neanderthals. The two populations coexisted for perhaps 10,000 years before Neanderthals disappeared from the record, a disappearance whose causes are still debated. Climate change, competition, disease, interbreeding to the point of absorption, almost certainly some combination of all of these. When the Beringia land bridge existed, but the ice sheet over Canada made an overland route through the interior nearly impossible. The emerging picture is that the Americas may have been peopled earlier than previously thought, possibly by coastal routes along the Pacific coastline, with populations moving south by watercraft along coastlines that were, once again, substantially different from those of today, and are now largely submerged. What this means is that the story of how humans crossed the world is not a simple linear narrative. It is a web. Multiple routes, multiple pulses of migration, multiple populations arriving at different times from different directions through different means. The peopling of the world was not a plan. It was the cumulative result of thousands of individual decisions made by people who had no concept of what they were accomplishing, to walk one more valley, to cross one more body of water, to follow the game one more season further than they had gone before. The psychologist and cognitive scientist Merlin Donald at Queen's University has argued that the key to understanding human migration is not to look at the geographic challenges, which were formidable, but at the social and cognitive structures that allowed humans to accumulate and transmit knowledge across generations. Navigation without instruments requires detailed knowledge of landmarks, stars, prevailing winds, ocean currents, animal behavior, plant distribution. None of this knowledge can be invented from scratch by a single individual. It is accumulated over generations through teaching, storytelling, and the kind of sustained cultural transmission that requires language, memory, and social structures capable of preserving information across time. The humans who crossed the world did not do it as isolated individuals or even as small nuclear families. They did it as communities carrying libraries of accumulated knowledge in their heads, passing that knowledge to their children in the form of stories, songs, rituals, and accumulated practical wisdom that allowed each generation to navigate environments their ancestors had never seen. Think about what this means. The footprints at White Sands, 22,000 years old, pressed into the mud of a shallow lake in what is now New Mexico, were made by people who had crossed half the world, navigated impossible terrain, survived conditions that would be fatal to most modern humans, maintained the social cohesion necessary to keep a viable population alive across generations, and still kept walking. Not because they were following a plan, not because they knew they were making history, but because moving forward was what their bodies were built for, what their communities were organized around, and what the accumulated wisdom of their culture had prepared them to do. You are sitting still right now, in a fixed location, in a building, on ground that has a name, but you are here because they did not stop walking. Because somewhere in your ancestry, a group of people stood at the edge of something they had never seen before, something immense and unknown and possibly impassable, and they crossed it anyway. You carry that crossing in your DNA. You carry it in the shape of your foot, and the length of your stride, and the capacity of your lungs, and the social instincts that make you reach for other people when the unknown is too large to face alone. The world was not discovered. It was walked into, one step at a time, by people who had no idea they were doing anything extraordinary.